Hi, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make fabric buttons at home. They're perfect for any of your embroideries and 18th century styled self-covered buttons. Stick around and I'll also show you how to go from a basic flat button to something with a really nice professional finish. The first thing you'll need to make a covered button is a button mold. The button mold is what is on the inside of your button to ensure that it doesn't, bend while you're using it. This can be anything from wood, bone, it can be turned, it can be plastic, you can have a profile on it, even quite a deep profile. You can use rings and you can use old buttons. Now if, for instance, you have a button like this that has quite an impressed design with the plastic button, turn it round and use this as the front of your button, as it were, because it gives you a nice flat surface for your fabric. Okay, so we're going to go with a basic flat MDF mold with a central circle. The central circle is left over from how they used to be made and how you can still get some made, which is a drill and or hand turning. It's not important for making the button. You could have a solid piece of card if you wanted to, because we're covering this with fabric. You'll need to make a pattern of some description. Now, the easiest way to do this is without any tools at all. Simply take a piece of paper, a pencil, draw around your chosen button. If you have a central hole, it does make it a bit easier because you can mark that center. Okay, and as you see, I'm not worrying about whether it's super straight or anything. But the reason that if you can mark the center or thereabouts, you can place your button up to the center and make a mark. And do this on the 4 quarters. And this will give you a rough idea of where you need the edges of your fabric to be. Now, some people like to cut squares and then just trim off the corners, which is absolutely fine. Some people like to do a nice circle. I'm of the school of thought that I quite like a circle. Now, you can either do something like this, which is use a template in order to draw your circle. So I've just come in a little bit on that one, which will be fine with the fabric that I'm using. I personally prefer my buttons to be a little short at the back to reduce bulk. You should always, if you have a really fancy fabric, try this out first with your pattern, just in case your fabric frays a little bit. Then you'll want more fabric. So cut out your pattern. As I say, it isn't, you haven't got to sort of worry too much about it. And don't forget, don't use your fabric scissors on paper. I know, it's the easiest thing in the world, but don't do it. You'll regret it. So then we're going to take a nice piece of fabric. And you can pin this if you want, but obviously if you're using silks or if you're using something that's embroidered, you don't want to pin it. So you either want to mark around the circle that you're making, or you just want to hold it in place and make sure that you've caught it. Very slippery fabrics, or if it's really vital to where you're actually making it. For instance, if you've got an embroidery and you have got a template tool, you can hold that clear over and line up so that you know you've got the center as you need it. The other ways that you can do it if you're using an embroidery for your core is that you can go ahead and draw your circle around and before you even start your embroidery. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to thread a needle with some strong thread, and I would advise that you use a matching thread. I'm using a darker color here because I want you to be able to see what I'm doing. I'm putting a small knot in, but honestly you don't need to put a knot in. That's entirely up to you, because what you're actually going to do is you're going to, that's my wrong side, not that it really matters with this particular fabric. I'm going to work 2 back stitches to start off, and as you see I'm making these stitches fairly close to the edge of the fabric but not right to the edge, okay? And then I'm going to work a running stitch all of the way around. And I'm working this running stitch with fairly small stitches because I want it to be as smooth as possible on the face of the button. And if your stitches are really spread apart, then you'll get more lumps and bumps at the sides of the button, and it'll be harder to actually smooth those out. It'll take you a lot longer. A little bit of attention at this point goes a long way to make a really nice button. And we're going to end on the opposite side. So in other words, we'll end on the right side of the fabric. Okay, I'm going to draw that up and create a little pouch. And then pop the button mold inside of that pouch and draw it up. As you can see, we've brought that up quite tight, draw it in, and with those small stitches, it's quite neat at the back, and a lot of people will actually say, that's brilliant, I've made it, and just secure it at the back. But if you do the next thing, which is a nice little pro tip, and it's something that is used in 18th and 19th century handmade buttons, it'll just help to finish it off. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to do a spiral wrap. So you're going to come up, and can you see where the valley is on this? So the valley is the depression. If you can take your needle into that and make a small stitch and come straight down, can you see how it's pulled at the edge? And then we're going to turn. It doesn't matter which direction you turn, whatever feels comfortable. And we're going to go into the next valley. And we're going to pull. And we're going to do this all of the way around, catching in and tightening that fabric as we go. And you can go back and do any areas that you think are not quite tight enough and not quite smooth enough along the edge. Now, if you are using an embroidery or something like that, take care as you're doing this pulling that your embroidery stays central to your button. It can slip if you haven't done it quite right initially and quite tight enough initially. It can slip. Another thing is that if you have decided that you just feel there's a little bit too much fabric there, go ahead and trim a little of that excess off before you start this tightening process. And so this spiral wrap, you can see that it's tightening up the edge and making a nice smooth button. And we're getting a nice smooth button on the face as well. So if we turn over, I mean, that is a nice tight button and a nice professional looking button. Okay, and then when you've finished, you can just go ahead and secure that thread. I use a little knot there, and then take the thread, the needle through, pull up quite tight, and the thread will sink into the back. And so now you can add a loop shank if you like, or if you're going with the 18th century or 19th century tradition, you would just sew right through the back of that fabric. And there is your first thread button. Now if you stick around, I'm going to show you an alternative, and gives a really, really great pro touch. A really nice way to add a pro touch, particularly to any embroidered buttons, and now this is whether you are using actual embroidery that you're making into buttons, or if you intend to embellish the fabric button that you're already making, is to add a little bit of padding. How much you add is entirely up to you. You can use anything that you like. Felt is really easy because obviously it's really easy to get hold of, and because you can draw your templates on them. So basically what you need to do is to draw directly on to the felt around your button mold. If you want quite a bit of padding, do a couple of circles, maybe 3. It's entirely up to you. You've got a few ways in which you can do this. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is we'll cut these out. Now, because we've drawn around it, we want to cut just a little bit inside of that line, because obviously the way that your pencil or your drawing will go, it just adds a little bit to the size, and you don't want it to be larger than your button mold. You can always check this by placing it on your button mold, and if you've got a bit that sticks out, you can trim it off that way. And again, it's not something that you have to worry too much to get it sort of too perfect, but this really does add a little extra professional touch. Okay, so I'm going to show you the differences of what you can do and a really professional touch. So you could simply stack them onto each other, which will give you a nice base, and it'll round off the edges nicely as you pull the fabric in. But another thing that you could do is that you can take one of these. It's often easier to fold it in half and trim more off so that it's even smaller. Okay, and this will give you a bit of a more of a domed, which would be hard to see here, but if you use 3, you'll see it far better once everything's put together. Let's see, that one's nice and round. So let's do this one, and we'll take this one. I think we'll take it just a little bit bigger than this one. So I'm trimming some off, but not too much. I think I'll trim a little bit more off of this small one, just to emphasize it a bit more for you as you're looking. That's not very circular, so let's just do that and get a little bit more of a circle going. And then we'll trim off a little bit more of this one, just so that our padding is a little nicer. Move that all out of the way. Okay, so there's our 3 pieces. Now I've already made up the cover in exactly the same way as I did previously. But before we put the button mold in, we're going to put the large piece of felt in first. And as I say, you could leave it at that and just go straight into the button mold. Then we're going to put the next largest in, and then the smallest. And of course, you can go from any stage that you want. And obviously, if you're using something very thick, you may not need to do this at all. And then we're going to gather around. And as you see, we have a nice profile to this button now, and that's already without actually doing the spiral wrap tightening. So we'll do that the same as we did earlier on in the video and not catch up extra bits of fluff to tangle my thread. And when you see this and compare to the two, you'll see what I mean about the difference. And it does really add a nice touch, and it is a great surface if you want to then embellish with beads or needlework. You've got something to sort of get stuck into without just pulling the fabric all of the while. It's also a really, really good way, even if it's just the one single piece, to use when you're using thin fabrics. If you strengthen that up just by having a little tiny bit of padding underneath, which can simply be a piece of cotton fabric if you're using a fine silk, because it will just give that little extra professional touch to your button. Let's see, I think I've about got most of them there. A couple of, no, that's it, there's one there. I noticed one of the edges is actually a rough part on the fabric. Okay, so I'll finish that off there. Make a small knot. Sink the needle under. And then pull up and trim close. Now, you see that nice sort of rounded edge that we've got? Compare that to the first one that we did. A completely different looking button, and yet the same principle. It's just that little bit of extra felt in there that's created something just to give a little bit of extra professionalism. And if you've enjoyed this video, please click the subscribe button. Thanks very much.